How many of you speak multiple languages? Who's bilingual? Bilingual, a couple of you, couple of you. All right. Anybody three languages? Anybody? Okay. A little bit? No, no. All right. Yeah, a couple of, maybe? All right. You know what I appreciate is that they asked the question in Icelandic, and I've been to Iceland, and I still had no idea. So that's a complicated language. I don't know if you know this. Icelandic is considered one of the hardest languages in the entire world to learn. Yeah, I know English is hard. But for English speakers, Icelandic is crazy. It's crazy because the rules are wild. Nothing makes sense. It's a free-for-all. It's an absolute free-for-all. But most of the time, I told you, I tried to go to Iceland. When I was on my way, I tried to learn some phrases in Icelandic before I went. And I'll tell you, there's only one word that to this day I still know, okay? There's only one word I got from all of my Icelandic training, and it's how you say goodbye. Do you want to learn? No. Okay. I'm going to focus on everybody except for Xavier. The way that you say bye in Icelandic is bless. Yeah. It's pretty good. Bless. All right, that's good. The rest of the language, though, absolute nonsense. Now, here's the thing. I usually like really complicated things. Like, I love board games. Does anybody like to play board games? Okay. Now, here's the deal. When I say board games, I don't mean like Sorry or Connect Four, or I like really complicated games. Let me do this. On three, I want you to yell at me your favorite board game. Ready? 1, 2. Wait, I didn't say 3. My goodness. 1, 2, 3. Ooh. Okay. A lot of classic Monopoly fans, a lot of chess fans. I heard the oldest boys in the room yell Fortnite, and I just don't know if they know what a board game is. So here's the deal. Shh. I really like board games. I really do. But the board games I like are board games that nobody wants to play with me, because when it comes to the rule list, the rules are massive. When I try to lead my family in games, I like a game called Catan. Has anybody ever played Catan before? Okay. In the game, I don't have time up here to explain the rules to you because there are so many. There's another game I love to play called Pandemic. And here's the deal. Pandemic is a game where the world has major diseases and your job is to cure the diseases. And unfortunately, somebody bought it for me like during COVID, and I was like, oh, this is a little dark. This is a little too heavy. I love to play these games, and sometimes, though, they have so many complicated rules that literally, there's one game that I took it to play with my friends, and it literally took me longer to explain the introductions and the rules than it did to play the whole game. I spent more time going, here are the rules, and then after 30 minutes, we played a 10-minute game, all right? That's how it goes. So here's the deal. Before we go into something that I think is really complicated about the Bible, let's turn into our tag groups. Let's have some conversations, and we'll be back. sometimes we can get overwhelmed by complex instructions. And this happens at school all the time. A teacher gives you an assignment and it has way too many rules, way too many instructions, way too much direction, way too open-ended, and you go, I don't even know where to start. I don't know what to do. I don't know how to figure this out. Or sometimes your parents will say, hey, I need you to do this. And you have no idea what that even looks like, what that even means. It's too complex, it's too big, it's too complicated. And you have the failure to act. You have no idea what to do. When we have too complicated of instructions or too complicated directions, often what happens is we don't do anything. Or often what happens is we make a mistake. We mess it up. And so there was a moment where Jesus was asked to simplify what it meant to follow God. And somebody went to Jesus and said, hey, Jesus, I think it's really like, I want to follow God. I want to do everything that God wants. But can I be honest? There's a lot of things. There's a lot of rules. There's a lot of things that I'm supposed to do, a lot of things that I'm not supposed to do. And sometimes I mix up when I should do this and when I should do this. When should I act like this? When should I? And how do I simplify this? And in Matthew chapter 23, this conversation plays out. In verse 35, it says, an expert in religious law. An expert. That means somebody who's really good at this. If you're an expert at anything, any of you feel like you're an expert at something? All right. What? Right over here in the black. What do you feel like you're an expert at? Baseball. Expert in baseball. Eating expert. Yeah. Yelling when you're mad. What? Soccer. Alessia. Being dumb. An expert. Last one, Finn. Fishing. All right. Now here's the deal. If you're an expert at something, it took you a while to get there. It took you a while to figure that out. It took you a while to get good at it. It was practice. It was all kinds of things. There was pieces that you had to do. This guy is an expert at following God, or at least an expert at understanding what God wants, and he was still having a hard time with this. And so here's what he asks. He goes to Jesus and he says, teacher, what's the most important commandment, or what's the most important rule in the law of Moses? And Jesus replied, you must love the Lord your God with all your heart, all your soul, and all your mind. This is the first and greatest commandment. Now, last week we started the series, Pop the Question, and we talked about God's love. And we talked about how loving God is important, and God loved us most, and he loved us first, and God is love by his very nature. The Bible says God's love, and so we know that God is love, so the most important rule is loving God. But then Jesus says this. A second is equally important. Love your neighbor as yourself. The entire law and all the demands of the prophets are based on these two commandments. Love's greatest use is for God and neighbors. Now, we don't use the word neighbors the way that the Bible uses neighbors. We don't use the word neighbors the way that Jesus understood neighbors. And in fact, the question that came up after that is, who's my neighbor? And I don't know about you. My house, so we're off of a main road, and if you drive down the main road, you turn on one street, and then you can go left or right. And you turn left on that street, and there's two more streets here to the right, but you'll make your third right, and that's my street. You're welcome. I would let all of you show up today. So here's the deal. Y'all are going to be in 18 different neighborhoods. I love it. Now, here's the deal. Who are my neighbors? Is it the people, because I technically only have one house on either side of us. So there's one house here, there's no house here, there's a house across. So one neighbor here, one neighbor here. Are those my neighbors? Or is my neighbors like the street? You know, like the street, those are my neighbors. Or like when you come off that main road and you have all of these streets, are those my neighbors? Like do those people count as my neighbors? And so this guy asks Jesus, and he goes, Jesus, who's my neighbor? And Jesus tells the story of the Good Samaritan. And you probably have heard this story a little bit, but let me unpack this for you, because the guy goes, wait, who's my neighbor? Who counts? And who would be outside of my neighborhood? Like, who do I have to love, and who do I not have to love? Jesus tells a story. He says, there was a guy who was traveling, and on his route, he was beaten up, he was robbed, he was stripped, and he was left. They thought he was going to die, so they left him on the side of the road. It's not really, most of us travel by car, but imagine the scenario where you were walking and it was dark out, and so there's no one around, and all of a sudden somebody came out and they beat you, they took your things, and they left you. And the first person who went by and saw this guy laying there dying, the first person who went by was something like a pastor. Pastor saw him and knew that it was dangerous. I mean, this is a dangerous place. Like, obviously, this guy was just left for dead, and so he walks on the other side of the road, trying to give as much space as possible, leaves the guy. The next person is something kind of like a worship leader, like somebody, it was called a Levite. So basically something like a worship leader sees this guy dying on the road. Maybe he was too busy, but he goes, nope, not going near that, and walks on the other side of the road. And then it says that there is a guy who comes on the road who was actually, technically, an enemy. It was a guy who was what was called a Samaritan, and they hated Jewish people, and Jewish people hated them. And so this guy sees his enemy beat up on the ground, about to die. And some people would go, good. You got what you deserved. Some people would walk by and be like, finally. And Jesus is telling this story. And the Samaritan shows up. The pastor walked by, the worship leader walked by, and then the enemy walks up. And it says the enemy gets off his donkey, bandages the guy, puts him on his donkey, so then now he has to walk. Takes the guy to basically the equivalent of a hospital, and tells him, hey, I'll pay whatever it takes to get this guy better. Jesus says, who do you think was a good neighbor? Do you think the pastor was a good neighbor? Do you think the worship leader was a good neighbor? Do you think the Samaritan was a good neighbor? And everybody in that group is like, yeah, Samaritan, right? Like because that's nobody really wants to hear that. They're like, the Samaritan. Jesus is like, yeah. So there's a few things that I think we take out of that story about how to love people and about how to love those who are our neighbors. And really, I think they challenge what we know about love. Here's what we think we know about love. Love is for the people who are easy to love. That's what we think. Most of the time, that's what we do. If somebody is really easy to love, we can love them. And as soon as they become difficult to love, we stop loving them. This week, one of my son's teachers informed me of a situation in class. And Andrew, I don't know if you heard this story, but you're about to hear it now, where one of my kids was in class, and his cousin decided that he was too difficult to love. His cousin, I don't know, they got in a fight in class, but during their fight in class, his cousin yelled out, "I'm done with you being my cousin. We are not cousins anymore." You know what he decided? He decided in that moment that as soon as my son became difficult to love, he was done loving him. Now it's really funny because you understand that you can't tell a family member, like, you are no longer sharing my DNA. It just doesn't. But here's the deal. We find it really easy to love easy-loving people. We find it really hard to love people who make it hard to love them. But this is what Jesus says in Matthew 5. He said, "You've heard the rules. The rule says love your neighbor, but you can hate your enemy." Jesus says, love your enemies. Pray for those who persecute you. In that way, you'll be acting as the children of your Father in heaven, for he gives his sunlight to both the evil and the good, and he sends rain on the just and the unjust. Do you know what Jesus says? There are going to be people that are in your school who are mean to you. And most of the time, as soon as somebody's mean to us, we go, "You're hard to love. So you know what I'm going to do? I'll be hard back. I'll be difficult back. I'll be rude. I'll be whatever it is." And Jesus says, no. When you have an enemy, that's somebody that you should be praying for. That when you have an enemy, that's somebody that you should be showing love. Often, even if we understand that, even if we know, hey, I'm supposed to love difficult people. I'm supposed to love people who are difficult. Oftentimes, we find that I just don't have time to care about everybody that much. I'm just too busy. I've got too much going on. All of my friends are hopping on Fortnite in 5 minutes. I just don't have time for this. And this is what we tend to believe. Love is special for the people who love me the most. Like I would take time to love people who were really special to me. Like you have, maybe there's someone in your family that you know they love you so much, and you know it would be a sacrifice, but if they asked you for something, you would do it. Years ago, my great grandma asked for some help, and she asked if I would come clean her house for her, and I was like, "Of course, Grandma, I will come." And when I showed up at the house, she had a dresser this big, and she said, "Can you dust that?" And I was like, "Sure." And I dusted it. And then she was like, "That was it." But what she really wanted was to hang out. And she spent the rest of that time trying to hang out. And here's the deal. Some of us we'll make time. We'll love people who love us a lot. But Jesus says that's actually not how this works. In Matthew 5:46, he says, "If you love only those who love you, there's no reward." He said, even corrupt tax collectors, which is a diss that we don't understand. But basically, Jesus says, even the worst people in the world do that. You get that, right? Like, think of a supervillain. They love the people who love them. That's why they always have sidekicks. Here's the deal. Jesus says, if you only love people who love you, that's not special. Everybody does that. He says, but you are to be perfect, even as your Father in heaven is perfect. And how does God our Father love people? God our Father loves people who don't love him. And I know it's easy for us to go, well, maybe that's not worth it, but Jesus says it is. There was a homeless man in Clarksville, Tennessee, who gathered outside of a church one Sunday morning, and beard was wild and large. His hair was mangled and crazy. He was dirty. He sat under a tree in front of a church, and as people were coming into service, there was about 10 people in this church who stopped and offered him help and tried to give him something, but there were many more people who walked right past him. Maybe they were busy. Maybe they were scared. Maybe they were like, well, my responsibility is for these people, and I'm not responsible for that guy. And so they walked into church. But as they were expecting the service to start, the church had a really great surprise. That morning, they were receiving a brand new pastor. He had just moved from out of state and was going to preach to them for the very first time. Earlier that week, the man named Willie Lyle had begun to go homeless and walk around the streets of Clarksville, Tennessee. But later on that Sunday service, he came and he stood up on the platform and said, I was the homeless man who sat outside this church for a week. And as his church watched, he had his hair cut and his beard shaved, and everybody at that moment went, oh my goodness, if we had known you were the pastor, if we had known that you were special, we would have stopped. If we had known you were important, of course we would have helped. If we had known we were supposed to love you, of course we would have loved you. But that's exactly Jesus' point. See, Jesus' point when he says to love your neighbor is he says that every person is important. And every person is special, and every person is worthy of being loved, and everybody is worth stopping for, and everybody, even if they're not your responsibility, God asks you to love them.